We are now on record.
So I think I'll start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event by IFSE, the Institute for Freedom of Faith and Security in Europe. My name is Peter Newman. I'm going to moderate this event. The event is about countering religious hatred, and we want to particularly focus on schools and the educational sector. And we have a fantastic panel who will be able to introduce themselves in a second. But I want to start, first of all, by giving the word to Chief Rabbi Pinchas Goldsmith, who is Chief Rabbi of Moscow and who is also the president of the Conference of European Rabbis, which is deeply involved with IFSE. So over to you, Chief Rabbi.
Thank you, Professor Neumann. Thank you, Peter, for organizing this event. I'm very happy to welcome all the participants in the panel and legislators and educators who are taking part in this very important panel discussion today regarding the issue of religious hatred, especially in education and in schools. And how do we counter this challenging moment, which is putting a big shadow on Europe at the moment. I would like to start with a personal experience. You know, I'm also, besides being the president of the Conference of European Rabbis, I'm also the Chief Rabbi of Moscow. And a few years ago, the state introduced religious education in the state school system. And the majority religion in Russia is the Russian Orthodox Church, and most children are being indoctrinated in the principles of Russian Orthodoxy. So one of those days, I had a child, a Jewish child, who applied to join the Jewish school in Moscow, and asked him what made him decide to join the Jewish school in Moscow. He said, so he went to a state school, and one day, some pupils came out from a religious indoctrination class, and a person came over to him and boxed him in the nose. So he said, what was this all about? He says, you know that your ancestors, you people killed our Lord. So he said, yes, but this happened 1,000 years ago. He says, yes, but I only heard about it today. So this shows, I think, that the challenge we have in conveying religious education in schools and in a way that it should not hurt and attack other children of other religions and of other ethnic groups. And I would like to that this challenge should be especially addressed today when we have renewed religious interest, especially in Germany, for example, where in Germany you have, within the state school system, you have the churches and the religious organizations sponsoring those classes, teaching religion to their children, and it's being sponsored through the state by the religious organization. And what we have to make sure is that within those this curriculum, which is being taught, that there are not going to be elements which are going to be dangerous to society, dangerous for those children, and dangerous for the future of Europe. And I think that this topic is extremely important because the basis of all of our identity of every one of us is based on our education, is on our childhood years, what we got. And when we do not deal with those challenges in those years, then the future looks very bleak. So without further ado, I welcome you all and thank you very much for organizing this panel discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Chief Rabbi, for an excellent introduction, which sets us up very nicely for the discussion. As Chief Rabbi Goldschmidt said, schools and educational institutions do have a responsibility for promoting tolerance and pluralism, quite simply because it is so important what we absorb and what we are shaped by in our early years. Yet, especially in recent months, incidents of religious hatred and of intolerance have been on the rise. And so we want to discuss what can be done to counter this trend. How should educators address polarizing events? What role do curricula play? And what can policymakers do? And in order to do this, we have 4 speakers, but I should also say that, of course, everyone in the audience can also participate in this discussion. You will see on your screen a little box called Q&A. If you want to comment or leave questions, you can type them in and I will pick them up once we are done with the introductory round. We have 4 speakers. One is still missing. Monika Hohlmeier is going to join us in a few minutes. She's just coming from a meeting, but that shouldn't stop us. I would like to start with sort of a description of the problem and then move towards the solutions and the prescriptions. And in order to do that, I would like to start with Jonathan Arfi, who is Vice President of the CRIF of the Jewish Central Council in France, and who, of course, being in France, has first-hand experience with a lot of these issues. So, Jonathan, could I ask you perhaps to give us an impression of what's happening right now? How do you see the situation evolving?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Chief Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt also. I'm very moved to say a few words about the situation in France, because as you know, France is the only country in Europe where pupils, Jewish pupils, were killed inside their own schools. It was in Toulouse in 2012 by the terrorist attack by terrorist Mohamed Merah. And of course, the issue of the role to be played by schools in the struggle against hatred is very central in France. In France, we have been raised with the vision that school was not the problem, but was part of the solution against hatred. And since the year 2000, we have seen in France that I would say external elements to the school system have penetrated the school itself and has had an influence on the level of tensions inside schools. To remind you of the situation since 2000 in France, as you know, we have had the start of the second intifada in the Middle East. And after that second intifada in the Middle East, we have witnessed inside the French society itself and inside the French school system, a lot of tensions and a lot of anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish pupils targeted by other pupils because they identify them with Israel. We have also witnessed the rise of claims inside the French public school system. For instance, claims for halal food, claims for exemptions for swimming lessons for women, but also a lot of claims regarding the pedagogical content itself, and I will come back to this issue. The consequence of that has been that we have seen that a lot of Jewish pupils have left public schools, not in every part of the French society, but mainly in underprivileged areas. In underprivileged areas where you can find a lot of pupils coming from immigration descent, with a lot of them coming from our countries, identifying with the Palestinians, with I would say, a higher level of anti-Semitic prejudices, you have seen that the Jews left the public schools to go to private schools, Jewish private schools, but also sometimes Catholic private schools, because they consider it they consider it safer for Jewish pupils. A book in the year 2002 named "The Lost Territories of the Republic" puts the stress at that time of the specific problems that was, I would say, raging inside the school system itself. And this book was a kind of shock for the, I would say, system, educational system in France, because there was at that time a lot of denial regarding this kind of hatred inside the school system. And the vision of the Ministry of Education for long had been to say that there was no problem inside the school system, that it was only external elements, and that the school had no responsibility in these incidents. It has changed because we had to put a lot of pressure on public authorities to understand that it was their own responsibility, that, for instance, the terrorists of Toulouse were born and raised in France, were educated in the French school system, and that France has a role to play regarding these issues. What can be done to struggle against hatred in the school system? I think that we have first to focus on the issue of the pedagogical content. For instance, we witness a high level of, I would say, memory competition. It's not so easy today to teach about the Holocaust in France, because some professors say that they have to face a kind of protestation by other pupils who say that we do speak too much about the Holocaust, but not enough about the colonization, not enough about the history of slavery, for instance. And we have to stop this memory competition, remembrance competition. It's very vicious. It's very dangerous for the Jews. And our main goal is to make people understand that we need a dialogue of memories instead of a competition. The second thing, we have to struggle against the demonization of Israel, because for young pupils, of course, very simple speeches about Israel, I would say, triggers a kind of hatred of Jews, even at a small level, even if it's not always violent attacks, but it's a kind of stigmatization of the Jews inside public schools sometimes. It's not everywhere in the French society. We need to be moderate in the way to evaluate it, but it's a reality in many areas, and it starts with the demonization of Israel. The third thing is that there is a lack of teaching of the positive contribution of Jews in the history of France and the history of Europe. If you look at the pedagogical content in schools, we talk about Jews only as victims. Victims for the Dreyfus affair in France, victims during the Shoah, for instance, and there is no real teaching about the positive contribution of the French Jews in the French society, or European Jews in Europe. And I think that's something which is key if we want to change the representations, the prejudices against the Jews in our societies among other pupils. My feeling is that schools have to be the place where we build a kind of community of faith, community of destiny between all European citizens. And it starts with a struggle against hatred. It starts with a vision of this content with more positive teaching about the Jews. And we, of course, in France, will try, as CRIF, as the Representative Council of Jewish Institutions in France, in our own dialogue with the Ministry of Education, we try to push for these points. So that's what I wanted to say today from a French point of view to start this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for very interesting and very clear remarks to start us off with. I want to now turn to Markus Scheff, who is the CEO of Impact SE, which is an organization that I'm sure he's going to tell us about in a second, which looks at curricula, which is another way of approaching this issue. And over to you, Marcus.
Okay, now
Marcus,
I'm unmuted,
yes?
yes? Okay, thank you
Yes.
so much, Professor Neumann. Honored to share this virtual platform with this deeply thoughtful group, and honored to share it with Rabbi Goldschmidt. And Mr. Arfi, your comments were fascinating. We have done some research on French textbooks, and after this call, I would love to make contact with you and look at that material with you. But I will start by saying that we all know, excuse me, that textbooks are uniquely authoritative. They convey, if you like, the political and social values that society wants to impart to the next generation, right? But this is particularly so in the Middle East, and that is what I am going to talk about for the next few minutes. In the Middle East, outside of Israel, you tend to get one book, one subject, one grade. So while textbook can be this powerful barrier against acting out violence, they can also be a blueprint for radicalization. And since 1998, Impact SE has been examining Middle East textbooks through UNESCO-derived standards of peace and tolerance, respect for the other, gender equality, no hate, peacemaking as the way to resolve conflict, economic prosperity, historical accuracy. And I will say there is good news. Our research shows real improvements across MENA textbooks. Example, the UAE teaches what it calls a moral education course, which is remarkable. It teaches wasatiyah, moderation, tolerance, respect, and peacemaking. In Jordan, King Abdullah II reformed the curriculum in 2014, producing a much more inclusive, tolerant set of books, and particularly as it talks about religion, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. Tunisia, we have felt, has been a role model in some aspects in educating about the importance of negotiations, peace, respect for the other, the way it talks about its own colonial past. Saudi Arabia, we did a report actually in 2003, 2008, 2019, and we were less than happy with that curriculum, as you can imagine. But our report in 2019 did highlight dozens of offending examples of hate which needed to be removed. It was taken to the highest levels of the kingdom. The Saudis acted. And so in September 2020, that new curriculum, there were really significant improvements. Just one example, an infamous hadith that said that Muslims would kill all the Jews. You know that one, very famous. They took it out. The classic anti-Semitic trope that Jews control the world, taken out. So, this shows us that change is possible. And I will say, obviously, we look at the Israeli textbooks regularly. They promote peacemaking. They depict Palestinian history, narrative, obviously Islamic religion, but also the Palestinian national struggle. The term Nakba is part of the Israeli curriculum, which is interesting, during a conflict which is existing. Not all is rosy, obviously. I'll give you a few examples. The Turkish curriculum was significantly radicalized by Mr. Erdogan in recent years. What does that mean? Jihad war has been introduced into Turkish textbooks as a central value, along with this ethno-nationalist religious vision, which combines neo-Ottomanism on one side, pan-Turkism on the other. Quite unique to Turkey and quite dangerous as well. Iranian textbooks, you won't be surprised, demonize Jews, they glorify terror, they talk about hegemony in the region. And obviously, we are not going to be able to change those. Syrian textbooks are the last of the Ba'athist set of materials. This vision of a greater pan-Arab empire stretching across the region. Qatar is a problem. Despite the US influence on textbooks in Qatar, anti-Semitism is central. And that is something we can and should work on. But I do want to focus on the Palestinian textbooks because there is that connection with Europe. So much European funding goes to the Palestinian Ministry of Education, either directly or through the Finance Ministry. And they were totally reformed in 2016. But along with Turkey, they are the only example in the region of textbooks getting worse, not better. Examples. In this new curriculum, peace is not presented as preferred or even possible. Peace agreements which were in the curriculum previously are taken out. So Palestinian children really have no idea of what peace looks like or should look like. There is one cursory mention of Oslo, but it's essentially doctored, and you know, children are taught this is not the way to achieve statehood. So what is in its place? Jews are liars and fraudsters, enemies of Islam. They control finance, media, and politics, those old anti-Semitic tropes. Children in the first grade, year 1, are taught a reading exercise using the letter Ha, and the examples are the word shahid, martyr, hujum, attack, Arab, run away. This is first grade, so what, 6-year-olds. 9-year-olds learn maths, not by adding apples or oranges, but by adding martyrs of intifadas. And when I say martyrs, you know, people who blew up pizzerias and buses and shopping centers. Newton's second law of motion is taught by encouraging 12-year-olds essentially to endanger themselves, to engage in violence. And Palestinian teenagers are taught that death is a right, dying is better than living. Salafi ideas in what is, you know, theoretically a nationalist Palestinian curriculum. I could go on, but, you know, just 1 or 2 examples. The example of 14-year-old boys taught that if they attack and get killed, they'll be rewarded with 72 brides in paradise. And girls are taught to get equality with boys, they too need to engage in violence. The 1972 Munich Olympics massacre is justified as an attack on Zionist targets. Terrorists are glorified. Dalal Mughrabi murdered 13 Israeli children, 38 all in all. She's a hero, and she, you know, she's told in these books that, you know, she is the one to follow. So none of this has gone unnoticed. I hope Mrs. Hohlmeier will join us. She knows, and she led the European Parliament twice passing cross-party legislation, overwhelmingly condemning hate in the PA curriculum. The United Nations Committee to Eradicate Racism and Discrimination condemned the anti-Semitism in the PA textbooks. And the Norwegian government actually cut funding to the PA Ministry of Education because of incitement in textbooks. So I'm just going to mention 2 more things before I close. 1, UNRWA. So UNRWA, firstly, the first thing you should know, they teach the Palestinian curriculum as is. Simple as that. Any thing we hear about UNRWA in relation to, you know, its own materials on the school books doesn't exist. But they did write their own material in 2020 because of COVID. And shockingly, some of it was just as bad as that of the Palestinian Authority. So, you know, you have a UN organization violating UN values, UNESCO standards, UNRWA's own stated principles, promoting hate, incitement to violence, glorification to jihad, martyrdom, terrorism. You know, Israel is a UN member state, and yet it is erased off all maps in these UNRWA materials and called the enemy. Students in the UNRWA's materials are called upon to defend the motherland with blood. So, you know, UNRWA said, okay, we obviously have a problem. There is inappropriate material here. Inappropriate was an understatement. And there has never been any explanation from UNRWA as to how it happened, what it did to make sure it will never happen again, and how, if these materials are in circulation, how they got them back. And clearly they didn't. So the European Parliament, again, which Ms. Hohlmeier was so involved in, also condemned UNRWA's hate teaching. Last thing, the EU review of the PA curriculum. So it's not out yet, it's a big secret, but the German newspapers Bild and Welt did do exposés, they obtained copies, and you know, they found what we found, that the PA curriculum teaches anti-Semitism, encourages children to violence and jihad, delegitimizes Israel. We also have a copy of this secret report, and we agree with all of that. They persist in the promotion of Jew hatred, these textbooks, according to the report. Peace agreements removed, essentially exactly what we have found. So you have an EU report confirming that the EU is paying money to the Palestinian Authority to teach children hate and to demonize Jews in Israel. And for this reason, both the Bundestag and EU Parliament members have said, okay, we need to put a stop to this right now. There are shortcomings in this report. Most of the books are not reviewed, so most of the time the reviewers miss hate. They miss hate in books they do review. They didn't do, that thorough a review, frankly. It's a flawed report. However, the bottom line is the bottom line. It's the same as ours. It confirms ultimately that the EU is paying for this hate. And I would just like to say to Ms. Hohlmeier how grateful everybody is for your leadership in making sure that the European Parliament will not stand for the continuation of hate teaching in the Palestinian Authority and in UNRWA, which is being financed by the European Union. So thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you, Marcus, first of all, for this a very interesting overview. And I'm sure we can share the address of your website where you can download all of the reports that you mentioned for people who are interested in reading more about this. I'm very grateful that Mrs. Hohlmeier has arrived. I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes to take a breather, Mrs. Hohlmeier, before we come to you. Let me first of all introduce Peter Rosengard, who is the founder and chairman of a very interesting organization in Britain. It's an organization called Since 9/11, and he'll tell us more about it. And you will see that it's a very interesting approach towards discussing issues of extremism, terrorism, and the promotion of tolerance within schools. Peter.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. From London, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me, Peter. Since 9/11 came from an idea that I stumbled on 10 years ago, just a year or so before the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And whilst we all remember, I think I can say, looking at the panel, we all remember, as everybody does, exactly where we were on 9/11, and something we'll never forget. Think of this: there isn't a child at school in the world today who was born. Not a child. There must be, I don't know, 2 billion, 3 billion children at school, and not one of them was born that day. Yet the world changed that day. And I don't just mean security at airports, of course. It changed geopolitically. It changed in every way. And these generation are growing up in a since 9/11 world. It all started with me hearing the steel was available. 2,000 pieces had been recovered, and we're in a giant hangar at JFK. And nobody really knew about this. And I managed to get a piece for the 10th anniversary for London, a monumental piece. It's nearly 30 feet tall, weighs 4 tons. It's the largest piece outside the United States. I got New York to give it to London. But what happened from that, it was a memorial, and that was it. We were going to put it up forever to show children and young people and everybody what terrorism does. It kills innocent people, of course. And out of that grew the idea to do an education program, because we were informed that schools were not teaching 9/11. They were not telling young people anything about it. And so we decided in 2010, we launched it on the 10th anniversary in 2011, September the 11th, along with the unveiling of the steel. We created with our wonderful partners, the world ranked #1 University College London, UCL Institute of Education, ranked #1 for I think 9 years running now. Their director immediately said, we wanted to create these education programs for you. And that we are a charity, and we are an education charity since 9/11. And our since 9/11 education programs, which you can find on just by putting in since911.com, have been acclaimed universally. They, in fact, in America, we work closely with the September 11th Memorial Families Director, Cliff Channon, who our Home Office in London, in the UK, and our Department for Education officially endorse our programs. They're free for all schools. Originally, it was just the secondary schools. We were advised that the subject was not appropriate for people under the age of 11. In fact, it was originally designed for 13 to 18-year-olds. It's taught in 5 modules. It can be chosen, it can be taught in the school in English, in history, religious education, citizenship, and art and drama. So there are 5 different modules that can be downloaded. It's being downloaded currently in the last 4 or 5 years over 10,000 times a year by schools up and down the country. 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, we seem to have lost a year, haven't we? I had the thought when we were talking about the problem earlier and listening to the tremendous problems you have that Marcus just spoke about and Jonathan. I realized that while we're in the middle of vaccinating the world against the COVID, at the same time, we've got to vaccinate the world against hatred, haven't we? And it's a massive problem, listening to my previous speakers. Since 9/11 is not any longer, and hasn't been for some years, just about 9/11. 9/11 is the departure point in our programs. Our mission is through education to tell young people the events, the causes, and the consequences of 9/11, but it covers right up to the attack on the Pittsburgh synagogue, the attacks on the mosques in Christchurch, the massacre of the 52 innocent people at prayer, Muslims in the mosque in Christchurch. It covers the tremendous growth in the UK, and I'm sure around the world as well, of right-wing extremism. So it's not aimed at Islamist terrorism, although obviously clearly we know the great majority of attacks have come from Islamist terrorism. But we're a non-denominational, non-religious, non-political education program. 3 years ago at Bloomberg in London, their new headquarters, we launched with they gave us their headquarters building to launch a primary school program. And as the chief rabbi opened up with his story, I just heard about it. The young guy said, I only heard about it yesterday. Well, 3-4 years ago, I was having breakfast with one of the anti-terrorism people in London who support our programs and our Prevent program. We're not allied. We don't endorse any program, but we certainly think they're doing a good job, the UK Prevent program. And he said to me, he took a call. He said, I've just had a call from a school. We were having a meeting. He said, a 7-year-old boy or 8-year-old boy had just walked into his school with his younger brother, and one had a knife and one had an axe, and they were going to kill the teacher. And this had come, where from? This is a young Muslim couple of boys. It had come from the home. It's not coming from the schools. It is coming from the schools, but it starts in the home. And we had a teacher. We held a national education conference in January in Birmingham. We had, I don't know, a couple of hundred headmasters and senior teachers. And the teacher said to me, she had a 5-year-old boy or 6-year-old boy go into his school in London, North London, and say to his classmate, 5-year-old classmate, I'm going to kill you. You're a terrorist. This is a white English kid saying to his Muslim British classmate, you're a terrorist. I'm going to kill you. So we, as a result of the input we got, we decided to do a primary school program, which we launched in September 11th at Bloomberg in 2018. It's initially in its early phases, it's for 7 to 11-year-olds. It's not about the horrors of 9/11. It teaches tolerance, and all our programs emphasize, very importantly, the words that have been spoken before: tolerance, respect for all faiths and religions. These are central, and we beefed up all our programs some years ago when these were made essential for all schools under what's known as fundamental British values. They have to be taught in all British schools. And we beefed up our tolerance, respect for all faiths and religions elements.
Peter.
I think I'd just like to close by saying problems clearly are enormous. Problems you have in France, Jonathan, seem to dwarf anything that we have. However, you mentioned community. I'd like to say the 3 C's in closing. Collaboration. It's the responsibility of all policymakers, educationalists, and all faith leaders, surely, to collaborate and agree that whilst difference is rightly celebrated, learning, tolerance, and harmony puts the kind back into humankind. Teaching tolerance and harmony puts the kind back into humankind. Secondly, the 3 C's, community, you talked about it. Young people have a passion for life, and they gather as youth communities around the world, across the world. We must convene events, symposia, conferences, delegations, and councils of young people to demand tolerance from global movements, from global governments. Just look at the power of community created by Greta Thunberg and Malala, who I had the pleasure of bringing to London for the first time with her family. Malala Yousafzai. Look at the power of community they have created. Schools and religious leaders must build the platforms for youth communities to come together. And finally, curricula. Marcus, you were talking about curricula. It's a fundamental necessity that tolerance and respect is the foundation for all curricula. I think we all agree that.
Okay.
The world is.
Peter.
So it's not them and us. I just want to finish this sentence. It's not them and us. Teaching has to stem from a universal approach, the oneness of humanity. The challenges we face must be approached from a position of collective, collaborative action, and this results in an interconnected, cohesive society that has no space or time for prejudice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. And like with Marcus, we will share the link to your website so that everyone can learn more about your organization. I think it's been a fantastic initiative, which has originated with you. That's why I wanted to highlight it. And finally, now we're coming to our last speaker of today, Monika Hohlmeier, a member of the European Parliament. She used to be Special Rapporteur on Terrorism. That's how I got to know her personally. And before that, of course, she was also, and that's why I think it's particularly appropriate to have her at the event, an education minister in the place where I come from, in Bavaria. And perhaps you can also a little bit draw on that experience. But over to you, Mrs. Hohlmeier, for your introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Peter Neumann. I'm very happy to see you. And I really appreciate your work. So you were our best expert in our special committee against terrorism. And may I give a warm welcome to all speakers and my full respect for your work. So as I was former minister for the schools and for all responsible for the religions, I have made my experiences in the area of extremism and in the area of radicalization in schools. Explicitly, we had a very, very strong dispute with Turkey at this time. Because former educational ministers had foreseen that the responsibility for the religion courses of Turkish Muslim young people are Turkish teachers, stemming from the religion ministry in Turkey. So, and there we found out at this time that the teachers had to sign several papers where they had to explicitly to sign several very radical extremist Turkish nationalist and anti-Semitic papers. So and then I stopped this cooperation. So Turkey was not very thankful to me. So we had really a huge dispute. So since this time, I'm fully aware of what is happening when you're stopping a cooperation in this area. and at the same time, we were facing the situation that suddenly people appeared giving a very good impression in the first stage, giving themselves very tolerant, very open-minded, very modern, stemming from associations that are helping in the integration, that are wanted to be helpful to the religious teaching for Muslim children in our schools. So I had a strong relationship with the Ministry of Interior, and I was always asking before I was doing anything, is this person known, perhaps? And in several cases, we were facing the situation that in the background there was Muslim Brotherhood, there were radical organizations like Milli Görüş, or other organizations that are known as extremist, Salafist, or Islamist organizations. And Peter Rosengart was telling about the very right wing. We met also on the other side organizations creating youth clubs for young people that are very problematic in the education, and they stem from the very right wing side. So as education minister, I really met, or school minister, I really met a lot of people trying to use young people because they are influenceable, they are open to influence, they are sometimes have problems when they are young in 14, 15, 16, 17 years, then they are against their parents, whatever, or they have certain problems. So, and these kind of organizations try to influence and to get in contact with these kinds of young people. So there, I think we really must be very careful. This is the reason why I took this knowledge or these experiences to my work here in the European Parliament. And at the moment, we are discussing with the Commission again the Palestinian school books. On Monday, I will discuss it with UNRWA again, because I said I don't accept that teachers that at the end are in schools that at the end are paid. We are not paying the books, but we are paying teachers in schools. We are paying UNRWA, and UNRWA is a partner for us. And I was asking very clearly to UNRWA that I don't want to see any books anymore that are full of hatred and full of explanations how you can kill other persons or hurt other persons, or where Jewish institutions are burning or whatever. And UNRWA was willing to work with us, but I got the information now that the study already to these Palestinian school books is already ready since a longer time. Commission was not presenting it. I was now asking that Commission is presenting it at once in the European Parliament. So they will do it in the next CONT meeting, in the budgetary control meeting. And we were asking that the curriculum standards of UNESCO are met in all schools that are led by UNRWA, even if it is in crisis areas or where UNRWA is working. I think UNRWA is a reliable partner, but we saw that in some cases where they're under pressure, in the situation of the area, they are not tough enough to really stand where they have to be. And this is a thing that we made here very clear. If the Parliament is open to give more money to UNRWA, then it must be very clear that in this area, it can't be that there are so many young people who are ready to lose their lives, that we are paying indirectly, perhaps, organizations or people that are part or even of terrorist arms or of extremist arms of organizations. So there we are asking very clearly that UN and UNRWA as partner has to clarify all money that is used. Commission was declaring to us that all money used would be in line with our goals. But at the same time, we see there are some things that are critical. So we will do a follow-up on this, and I won't stop with it. I'm very happy that I have my colleague Maria Grappini from SD in the committee, because in the first stage SD was a little bit critical, but Maria Grappini took the initiative and was ready to put an amendment and persuaded parts of SD, so that we had a quite large majority, because Renew was on our side and ECR at the end was on our side. The rest was against us. But I see that in AFET committee there is now a bigger awareness. I will invite as chair the AFET committee, so the Committee for External Affairs. So, and we will continue with our work. What is the next goal is that the Commission has now to realize the promises that we are creating an institution that is helping moderate Muslim, and that the moderate Muslims don't need to go to churches or to places where very extremist, well-funded from third states, well-funded organizations are trying to attract them. Or to attract their children. Secondly, I'm still asking even Germany to stop the funding from third states, because this funding of third states of Muslim organizations is mostly not very tolerant and not very helpful. Mostly it is, Peter Neumann knows it very good, is mostly done in a way that attracts young people for radical ideas, Salafist ideas, or quite radical organizations. They start with young clubs, and then it continues in the way when they have attracted them. So we will continue our work, dear Peter Neumann, step by step. But may I be clear, not all member states are willing to name the things as they are. You know that? And when I see sometimes even in Germany, the same is in Great Britain or somewhere else, where our Jewish community is really irritated because if you wear openly clothes that identify you as Jewish, for example, in Berlin or in Cologne, there are areas where it is very problematic. And I think we should not accept this kind of situation. So it is really necessary to be active and to give children a better perspective. So we need to make them, to help them to find institutions where they can be without any influence of extremist organizations.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hohlmeier. That was very comprehensive. We don't have that much time left, but I want to just bring in one comment that we've had and one question. The comment is from Murat Kayman, who is a prominent figure in Germany and also an educator. And his comment is, in public debates and also in education and policy, partly unspoken ideas of superiority still dominate. As a result, corresponding narratives in the interaction of people in an increasingly heterogeneous society. Everyone assumes the superiority of his or her beliefs or cultural imprint. We cannot positively shape our coexistence with such hierarchical competition. And the question, or the challenge then for educational systems, is to break that narrative of superiority. And then we have one question from a very concrete question from a teacher from Berlin who is in the audience, who says he experiences every day, especially at times of heightened tension in the Middle East, false narratives of the Middle East conflict. So as a teacher, and how should he address or discuss these conflicts if and when they come up? And that is, of course, a very difficult question. So that's why I'm turning to Jonathan and Peter. So how should these as a teacher, how should you address conflict in the Middle East?
I'm okay to start and try to answer this question. I think the main goal should be to introduce the idea of complexity. We don't need to have people supporting Israel. We just want to have people understand that things are more complex than one they can imagine first. And, it's always the same thing. It's a question of nuancing, I think it could be a first step in the way to, I would say, thwart the effects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict inside our own societies in Europe. We don't want to have any imported conflict. Regarding the second thing he could maybe insist on is the fact that, of course, we can have empathy for people in the Middle East, for the people we feel closer in a way, but we cannot really identify. Human experience is based on the place you live in, the people you live with, and not on a representation in your head only. And that's something which also has to be maybe said and said again in order to remind pupils that they cannot leave a conflict they are not part of, and they have to build their own society of with peaceful relations inside Europe instead of dreaming of a conflict they are not part of.
Okay, very good. Complexity, nuance, and empathy. I think they are very important elements. Peter, in your modules, do you encounter that issue?
Well, we don't encounter, we don't in our modules talk about Israel and the Palestinian conflict issues. At least as far as I understand at this moment in time. When we set this up in 2011, this is before I'm right in saying before the Intifadas and so on, certainly before the second one. I think it's a very, very complex issue. I'm not sure I finished my point about making our whole reason for existing is through education to attempt to ensure similar atrocities like 9/11 don't happen again. That's our mission, through education. And we had a very interesting dinner with the head of MI6, who's the British Secret Intelligence Services. He came, he showed the importance. We were amazed that he would attend this very small dinner for 10 people, fundraiser, on 18th of May 2017, just before we were launching a year before we launched the primary school program. And the director of the Secret Intelligence Service sat next to me and said, the single most important, this is the last thing he said, the single most important thing for the future, a peaceful, harmonious future in the West, is the education of young women in the third world, in Asia and the Middle East, the education of young women. Why? Who is closer, he said, to the child? Where is the extremism coming from? It's not coming from the mother, it's coming from the males, from the men. Who is closer to the child? Nobody than the mother. So he said the education of young women is the single most important priority for the future of young women in the third world. And I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, I have to stop you, Peter, because we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask Marcus if you've come across any positive examples, perhaps, of how conflicts can be talked about in schools.
Excuse me. Of course, I think there are several examples, and I would agree with Jonathan in relation to teaching complexity. Clearly, contextual analysis is absolutely key. But those UNESCO standards, we always go back to that because that is the framework to teach anything, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you're teaching within that framework of respect for the other, respect for the individual other, peacemaking as a way to resolve conflict, historical accuracy, which is extraordinarily important in relation to this particular issue. It is a lot harder to go wrong. I'll just give you one example. Time is short, and that's actually on the Israeli curriculum, which teaches the Palestinian narrative in relation to what happened in 1948, as well, obviously, as the Israeli narrative. So, you know, that I would not advocate every single time for this idea of competing narratives. I think it gets educators in a spin, and I think it gets children extraordinarily confused. But there are occasions when the expression of the narrative of the other can be useful, especially when you are, you know, the dominant culture with a, you know, non-dominant people within who have a narrative which it is important to express to that mainstream.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcus. Our hour is almost over, but before we close, I want to give Chief Rabbi Goldschmidt another opportunity to perhaps respond and take up some of these issues, and then I'll close the event. Chief Rabbi.
Thank you, Peter. This panel was very informative. I learned a lot. And at the end of the day, I think we all realize that what we are discussing are not only textbooks. What we are discussing is actually human lives and our future, because the basis of anyone's identity is based on the impressions a child gets during childhood years. The first impressions last the most. So I think that it is extremely important to stop this laissez-faire policy of subcontracting the issue of school books on religious education to third countries, to third parties. It has to be, this might be the most important part of a curriculum shaping the identity of the pupil. And once we miss the boat, we miss it. So it is extremely important. And as it was said, a child who grew up with the idea that Jews are descendants of apes and pigs will have a much easier time carrying a bomb into a synagogue than a child who grew up knowing that you have different people of different religions and different nationalities, and we all have to respect. We don't have to love each other, but we have to respect each other, and we have to live together and build a joint future together. And I would like just to add as the last point, if we're talking about education, there's another piece we did not really discuss today, is the education of religious leaders. Religious leaders who have influence over hundreds and thousands of people are even more important. And therefore, it is very important that religious leaders should be taught the basics, the basic principles of European identity and European values. And we wrote a letter to all the 27 ministers of the interior right after Charlie Hebdo in 2015 regarding this issue, that we have to make sure that in terms of education, whether it is education of children or education of religious leaders, that they have to be educated within our value system, the European value system of pluralism, respect, and tolerance. Peter, really, thank you so much for organizing this wonderful panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Chief Rabbi. I think this was a very interesting and fascinating discussion with lots of things to follow up on, which indeed we will. IFSE is a new institute. It's going to be hopefully formally launched with an in-person event in Brussels in September. So you will hopefully see us in person. and issues around education, education in schools, education of religious leaders will be an important topic for us. So we look forward to seeing you. Thank you to all the panelists for your time, and hopefully we will see you again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Bye.